You may have never realized it, but the word unique starts with a capital D. Warp's D may be the most unique horror experience on a console. Not so much a game as it is an interactive movie, D is still one of the scariest experiences in gaming. Released in 1995, appropriately enough the same year as Pixar's feature debut Toy Story, D was the first 100% CGI game. It was like Myst, if instead of clicking to the next step, your character physically moved, and instead of a deserted island, a haunted castle. By its very concept, D has little inherent replay value, and just maybe too unconventional for some tastes. But for those who can get into it and love a good scare, lock the door, turn out the lights, and crank up the sound. D is a gaming experience you may never forget.
D was released on the PlayStation, the short-lived Sega Saturn, and the even shorter-lived 3DO. I'm playing it on the Saturn, but all versions are virtually identical. I mean, I'm sure 13 years ago, some would be able to argue about which version looked best, but it's a moot point now because they all look bad by today's standards. What you have to realize is what a bold move this game was. I mean, CGI in video games was a pretty new thing back in '95. D was released at the tail end of the full-motion video craze of the mid-'90s.
No! Don't go!
And games are just starting to have little CGI bits, but a whole game of it was unheard of at the time. But straying far from the mainstream was the typical MO of Warp games, but we'll get to that later.
Richter Harris is the respected and beloved director of a rural Los Angeles hospital. That is until one day he suddenly snaps and goes on a murderous rampage, killing many of the hospital staff and its patients. Police summon Laura, his daughter, to go and talk to the doctor who has barricaded himself inside the hospital, holding the surviving patients as hostages. What could have possibly drove this man to such barbaric actions? Will Laura be able to penetrate the riddle of her transfigured father? I took that last part from the instruction book.
As a game, D is as basic as it gets. You move Laura around by pushing the direction you want her to go. She'll move in that direction and then stop at an invisible intersection. From there, you can manipulate what's in front of you or move on. Using the shoulder buttons shifts through your inventory, and that's about it. I told you it was unconventional. D is more of an interactive movie than it is a game. There's some pretty tough puzzles, but other than that, you just sit back and enjoy the thick, creepy atmosphere and wonder what kind of weird shit's around the corner. But just because there's little interaction doesn't mean this game is boring. Well, maybe for some. Now, a common horror movie convention is watching our heroes go into places they probably should not go, like outside to investigate a noise or into a stranger's house. When you yell at the screen,
What are you doing? No, don't go in there!
that's a scary movie doing its job. What makes horror games so scary is forcing the player to go into those very places they would rather not go. I recall saying out loud while I was playing Silent Hill for the first time, "I'm not going in the hospital morgue, are you crazy?" Or, "Oh great, a secret staircase in the basement. Can't wait to go in there." But D is scary because of its unrelenting creepy atmosphere. Unlike Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there are no safe rooms. There is no downtime between areas. You are constantly in a place you don't want to be. Not only that, you have no choice but to venture deeper and deeper into it. And Warp makes sure that you get the most out of your time there. If you can really get into this game, you will constantly be on edge. You really don't know what to expect next. It is established very early on that D takes place outside of the confines of reality, so anything can happen and it doesn't really need to make sense. Before long, you'll realize that every part of every room that you can explore has some creepy gag waiting to creep you out. It might be the subtlety of the music, or just something about the room that you're in. The journey to the end of D may be short, but it offers virtually no downtime. With the exception of maybe one puzzle. And since you don't really have complete control of Laura, you never really get a good chance to explore and become comfortable with your surroundings. This can heighten the mood, as sometimes you'll be standing at the threshold of a new room that you might not want to just run into. In Resident Evil and Silent Hill, you can ease your way into a suspicious room. Take your time and explore, make sure things are safe before pushing onward, but not in D. You're either in or you're out. Pick one. Now. And I mean now, because the clock is ticking. There are only a few ways you can die in this game, and one is if you take too long to complete your journey. You take longer than 2 hours to finish D, and it's game over. But that's the limit. I personally have never taken longer than an hour and a half to finish this game. But that means there are no save points, and I really like this, no pausing either. But you can't deny the fact that this is a very short game with very little replay value. But again, it's more like a movie than a game anyway. And just like a good scary movie you've seen before, it's worth playing D once every couple years. I've long since played through the Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, but every once in a while, I just gotta play through them again. And D is no different. It's a very short but very memorable experience. It's never as scary as it was the first time, but that doesn't make it not enjoyable. The concept, story, and execution of it all make it an experience worth revisiting at least twice. But please, don't go watch videos of D online. You're only cheating yourself. This is a game you have to experience at home with the lights off and the sound up. Hell, that's the only way to play games like Fatal Frame and Silent Hill. And you'd never guess, this game also has an interesting history, so let's hit it.
D was made by Warp Games, a company headed by Kenji Eno. Warp made a whole range of strange and unusual titles, not just horror games. But most of these never made it outside of Japan. The history of Warp is definitely an interesting one, but is for another time. This is a review of D, so I'll stick to D and its respective sequels. Apparently, D was heavily censored in the US, which is quite amazing considering what they left in. This is probably the most graphic teen-rated game of all time. While it was a big hit in Japan, it wasn't very successful in the US. There exists an extremely rare Japanese version of D called D's Diner for the 3DO. It's sort of a super ultra mega double dip director's cut. According to an interview, this version was sold and hand-delivered to buyers by Kenji Eno himself. Interestingly, the English translation of the Japanese name D no Shokutaku was incorrectly translated as D's Diner by the now defunct Game Fan magazine. While D's Diner does have a good ring to it, Shokutaku actually means dinner table, which makes a lot more sense since the setting of this game is not a diner. D was eventually followed up by D2 for the Dreamcast, but before we get to that, there were actually a couple games that came between D and D2. Enter 1997's Enemy Zero for the Sega Saturn. Enemy Zero was sort of a spiritual sequel to D. It was a horror title, played in the first person, and starred Laura. Not the same Laura per se, Laura was a digital actress as it were. Enemy Zero is famous for its free-roaming first-person segments, where you had to tread through sprawling, dimly lit corridors, trying to avoid monsters you couldn't see. And these weren't monsters that would hurt you, nope, we're talking instant death. Since you couldn't see them, you had to depend on a chime that got faster and faster the closer and closer they got until... Yep, you died. And it leads to some pretty tense shit, let me tell you. Next came D2, but not that D2. D2 was originally going to be the flagship title for the M2. What the hell is the M2? The M2 was going to be the successor to Panasonic's 3DO. And I say, was going to be because the M2 was scrapped and never released. Had the M2 been released, we would have seen a D2 that starred Laura's son and was more free-roaming. But as the M2 was scrapped, so was this version of D2. The D2 we all know is this one. Now, despite its title, D2 has almost nothing to do with D and has absolutely nothing to do with the scrapped M2 version. D2 had Warp's trademark creepy-ass story and tall supply of weird-ass shit, and once again starred Laura, but was more like a typical survival horror game. In fact, Kenji Eno pretty much quit games after this because he felt he was becoming too conventional. And I will say that is definitely one of the game's faults. Enemy Zero and D2 are both pretty unique and awesome games, and I suppose one of these days I'll have to tell you more about them.
Alright, paisanos, that's it for now. So, until next time, this is the Happy Nerd saying, stop emailing me about the Splatterhouse remake. Cheers. Because I already know about it!